All right, we have about 1 minute or we'll get started here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It is 11 o'clock. Want to say good morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. I am Crystal McCain, Director of Employment with the Human Rights Commission. And today we have, our topic is LGBTQ equality, and we have Marjorie Schaeffer, PhD, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at St. Mary's College. So we're very pleased to have her. We want to ask that everyone stay muted during the webinar, and if you have a question, to please put it in the chat, and we will try to get to it. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Marjorie. Thanks for being here with us today, Marjorie, and good morning.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I really appreciate the introduction. Here, I'm going to turn on my screen. Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. As Crystal said, my name is Marjorie Schaeffer, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology at St. Mary's College. I use she, her pronouns. Part of what I study is how children understand gender. So how do those ideas about gender develop, and what does that look like for young people? So today I'm going to talk a little bit about LGBT equality by first starting to talk about terminology and definitions, and then we'll move on to talk a little bit more about best practices. As Crystal said, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and there'll also be more time at the end for questions. So I want to begin by looking at this image here. And so what you can see here in this very simplified version is an image that's separating out gender identity from gender expression, from sexual orientation, and from assigned sex at birth. In the English language, we often use the terms sex and gender interchangeably, but these words mean different things, and the differences are meaningful and important. So today we're going to start by talking a little bit about sex assigned at birth and how that's different than gender and gender identity. So if you've ever been invited to a gender reveal party, this would be much better labeled as a sex reveal party, and you'll see why in a second. So as I was saying, sex and gender are not the same. Sex refers to this biological difference, so we can think about chromosomal differences, hormonal differences, things like body hair, body shape. And historically, we've defined male as being capable of producing sperm, and in humans associated with having a penis and testes. And female historically has been defined as being able to produce ova, eggs, and associated with having a vagina, a uterus, and ovaries. In mammals, we think about females as having these mammary glands. So what causes a person's sex? So throwing back to 7th grade sex ed, you might remember that the sperm is going to add either an X or Y chromosome, and the egg always carries an X chromosome. Right? And so our options here are XX, which we consider female, and XY, which we consider male. And early in development, all fetuses look identical. So having nipples, undifferentiated genitalia, the only indication of genitalia we see is a groove. By the 8th week, the Y chromosome causes testes to develop, and they begin to secrete testosterone. About 4 weeks later, the uterus begins to develop, and this happens unless testosterone has been released from the testes, and the androgens block this development. Right? So without any intervention, what we associate with female genitalia will develop. So androgens close the groove and lead to the development of a penis. But this is not exact. For example, people who have XY androgen insensitivity syndrome have the XY chromosomes that we associate with male, but are insensitive to androgens. And so a person with this condition would have some or all of the physical traits of being female, but the genetic makeup of a man. Again, thinking about sex as merely X and Y or XX is really too simplistic. We know there are many people who are intersex, which has been defined as having this biological characteristics of both male and female sex. Current estimates range from 1 in every 100 births to 1 in every 60 births, depending on the definition. And many people do not become aware that they're intersex until puberty or even attempting to conceive, and therefore doctors believe that this is really an underestimation. Being intersex is as common as having red hair in the United States. Right? And so instead of us viewing this as an anomaly, we should really view it as part of the experience of sex for humans. And current medical guidelines suggest that no medical intervention is necessary or appropriate upon birth or early childhood. In fact, Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago announced this year they will not be doing any surgery on intersex children. Instead, medical best practices suggest allowing individuals to make decisions about their own care when they're old enough. But these are not decisions we need to make immediately. These are not medical problems. Instead, these are societal problems about accepting people. So we've talked a little bit about how sex doesn't equal gender. So I want to talk a little bit about what is gender. So we think of gender as the social and cultural construction of what it means to be feminine or masculine. So I would encourage you to ask yourself, how do I need to function so that society perceives me as belonging or not belonging to a specific gender? So our gender identity is how in your mind you define your gender. And this gender expression is the ways in which you present your gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. And so choices that I make about appearance, about hair, about clothing choices are all part of my gender expression. I really want to highlight that thinking about sex and gender as binary ignores that both sex and gender exist on this spectrum. So thinking about sex or gender is really, as binaries, is oversimplification. In fact, there's an incredibly large range of healthy amount of testosterone in adult women, many of which go into male ranges. This is perfectly normal. And how feminine or masculine people feel or act varies widely and changes over time. So psychologists who look at this see that our feelings about our own gender identity change drastically, especially over adulthood. So, and most importantly, for almost all behaviors, the variation we see within gender, so looking at women compared to women or men compared to men, is as big, if not larger, than the variation we see between genders. So between men compared to women. So if your gender identity matches the sex you were assigned at birth, we call this cisgendered. So for example, someone who identifies as a woman and was assigned female at birth, we would call this person a cisgender woman. Sometimes people feel like the term cis is offensive, and that's really not true. It is a label that we use to explain having this consistency between the gender you were assigned, right? The gender that you identify with and the sex you were assigned at birth. However, if your gender identity does not match the sex you were assigned at birth, we call this transgender. Some people make the mistake of adding an ED, saying transgendered, and that is incorrect. So currently, we don't have a full understanding of what leads someone to be transgender. There's some suggestions that it's influenced by genetics, hormones, and environmental factors. Some people who are transgender choose to have gender confirmation surgery. So this is surgery to change genitalia or chest to match the gender a person identifies with. However, one does not need to have surgery or choose to take hormones to be considered transgender. This is about people's assigned sex at birth not matching their gender identity. And many people who are transgender choose not to do this, and there should be no expectation that one must. 5 points editing this so far suggests that we have this either or, and that's really, again, this simplification. We know that many people are gender non-binary or gender queer, and that this is a spectrum of gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or feminine. And people who are gender non-binary may make different choices about pronouns. So, for example, may choosing to use they or them. However, of course, this is not universal, and it's always okay to ask. So I want us to go back to this image that we started with. So we've talked a little bit here about how sex is physical sex, the characteristics you're born with and develop. So genitalia, body shape, voice pitch, body hair, hormones, chromosomes are distinct from this gender identity. So what you know you are in your mind, right? How you define your gender, and then this expression, how we choose to show to the world. Yes. So now we're going to talk about this additional piece, sexual orientation. So attraction. So who is one sexually attracted to? And so sexual orientation refers to a person's physical or emotional attraction to individuals on the basis of their gender. We define heterosexuals, also straight is a term we commonly use. So these are individuals who are attracted to partners who have a different gender than their own. Gay, lesbian, queer, these are all terms that get to the same idea. So individuals who are attracted to partners who are the same gender as themselves. Bisexual, so individuals who are attracted to both men and women as partners. And pansexual, someone who is attracted to people of all gender identities. So the prefix pan means all, rejecting this gender binary and arguing that some argue is implied by bisexuality. So this is a good example where language is evolving and changing, and people make individual choices about the label, if any, that best fits their identity. And of course, we should respect the labels individuals choose for themselves. And finally, asexual, sometimes called ace, and so someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. So psychologists think about sexual orientation as happening on a continuum. Right? So what's pictured here is the Kinsey Scale, so going from 0 to 6, with 0 being exclusively homosexual, exclusively interested in people of the same gender, with 6 being exclusively heterosexual, exclusively only interested in someone of the opposite gender. And sometimes people think of 3, this being equally heterosexual and homosexual, as being where all bi people or pansexual people fall, and that's absolutely not true. People who identify as both bi and pansexual can fall anywhere along this continuum from 1 to 5. It doesn't mean an even split. And what we know from the most current psychological research is that sexual orientation isn't stable, right? That many people experience changes as measured by the Kinsey Scale, changing where they identify, who they're attracted to at different points in their lives. Another term you may have heard before is the term queer. And so queer was at one time a derogatory slur. However, now it's been reclaimed by members of the LGBTQ community, and particularly among younger individuals and in the academic community, right? So there are many people who use the word queer as a sign as being outside of mainstream, outside of specific labels. Right? However, it's not accepted by all in the community, especially older members. So this is a good example where see what labels individuals use and match the labels back. Like let someone pick their own labels, the labels that match for them, that are meaningful for them. So what determines a person's sexual orientation? The overall summary is that right now psychologists don't know what makes someone gay or straight. We don't know what makes someone heterosexual to begin with. However, our best understanding is that a set of complex factors are assumed to be at work to determine someone's sexual orientation. So we know that genetics do seem to play a part, and we know that primarily from looking at twin studies. And so, for example, in some studies, if one identical twin is gay, there's a 50% chance the other twin will also be gay. If we look at fraternal twins, right, the chances drop to 20%. Right? And so, as a reminder, identical twins have identical DNA to each other, and fraternal twins are no more related than any two siblings. Right? And so, the difference between these suggests that genetics likely play a component. There's also some research that suggests that differences in brain function, perhaps caused by the prenatal hormones environment, are found in some gay men, especially gay men with multiple older male siblings. However, the important thing is whatever the cause is, people experience little choice in the matter. Sexual orientation feels innate to almost all individuals, predetermined and not something that can be controlled. And I really want to highlight again that psychologists, while we don't understand what makes someone gay, we don't understand what makes someone straight either. This is really an area of continued research. So there have been attempts to try to change people's orientation. And to date, there's no scientific evidence or adequate research studies that show that any therapy can change a person's orientation, is safe or effective. And so this is currently a statement released from the American Psychological Association this past year. And almost all of the research looking at conversion therapy shows that people report a highly negative experience, harmful long-term effects, both in the moment and years later, and it being ineffective. Which is why many states have come to ban conversion therapy for children, right, for people under 18, because it's ineffective and highly damaging. Instead, we should view sexuality, sexual orientation as something without our control, something to be embraced and accepted. So if we don't know what makes someone gay or straight, what do we know? We know that heterosexuality has never been the only orientation. Homosexuality is not new, it's existed in all cultures. When we look at anthropologically, we see a variety of cultures, including ancient Greece and China, some African cultures that were highly accepting of same-sex relationships and bisexuality. As psychologists, if we look to the animal literature, psychologists often use animal models to tell us things about humans. We see that homosexuality occurs in animals as well. So, contrary to this popular belief, many animals show homosexual behavior. So we see this in birds, in sheep, in penguins, bats, dolphins, and orangutans. We also see evidence for same-sex courting, pair bonding, and parenting in separate species, right? So beyond sexual behaviors, we also see animals choosing to make long-term pair bonds with creatures of the same sex. So studies of bonobos, African apes, which are closely related to humans, suggest that 75% of bonobo sex is non-reproductive, and nearly all bonobos are bisexual. So you see here this image from this children's book that came out a couple of years ago about Roy and Silo. And so these were two male penguins who successfully hatched an egg from another pair of penguins. And so two penguins of the same sex raising a penguin together. So I'm going to return to this image here. So I'm hoping everyone feels confident about how these are individual constructs, how we think about sex as these physical characteristics. Gender identity is what in your mind, how you define your gender, this expression, how you're presenting it to others, and then attraction as this sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. And these are distinct constructs, and we should be really careful not to use them interchangeably. So now I want to switch a little bit to talking a little bit about the state of the LGBT community today. So, we know that the LGBTQ community still faces many challenges, despite the great strides we've made in the last few years. We still know that there are many problems. So I pulled some statistics that really highlight this. So 38% of openly LGBTQ people report that they've been harassed at work. LGBTQ adolescents are more than twice as likely to have attempted suicide than their straight cisgendered peers. At least 22 transgender and gender nonconforming people, almost all Black transgender women, were killed in 2019. And 28% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, and this is disproportionate to the percentage of LGBTQ youth in the general youth population. And because of violence, the life expectancy of a trans woman of color is only 35 years. And so what I want us to think about now is how can we as individuals help change these statistics? And what I hope to argue is that one way we can do this is by all committing to being allies. Right? So what does it mean to be an ally? To be an ally is to join another person, group, and to give support. The most important part of this definition is that ally is a verb. Like any other verb, being an ally demands action. So we'll talk a little bit today about how we can support others. And everyone has the capacity to be an ally for somebody else. So even if you identify as part of the LGBTQ community, you can be and should be an ally for others in the community. For example, gay, cisgender people can be and should be allies for transgender folks. I really love this image, this onesie I once saw on a child recently. Being an ally is a verb, and I think that's a really important message. So one way we can be allies is to make our language inclusive. We should avoid gendering people. So don't assume people are a certain gender. Be intentional about being inclusive. Your language will tell other people whether you are someone you can trust and that they can trust, that they believe that you can support them and care about them. So we can tell people that you promote a positive environment where everyone is included and accepted. Don't put people in boxes. People have gender, clothing does not. And then another way is you should avoid binary language. For example, using things like partner and spouse, wife or husband. For example, if we're having an event where formal wear is suggested, I guess that's another era post-COVID, hopefully. Instead of saying suits for men and dresses for women, we might say things as formal wear, suits and dresses. We can also use things like folks instead of ladies and gentlemen. I also want to encourage you to use and share your pronouns. Sharing your pronouns prompts a conversation about gender and raises awareness that gender is complex. They create a welcoming environment for people of all genders, and they make it easy to know which pronouns to use when you aren't sure. This also creates space for people with uncommon pronoun sets to communicate them easily. While this type of introduction might make some people confused, it's a wonderful opportunity for you to have a conversation about gender inclusivity with others. You can explain why you're doing it and what it really means, why it's important to not misgender someone and that you care about these issues. So I want to encourage you to take action and speak up when you hear something that's non-inclusive. Since speaking up is both challenging and important, I'm hoping for us to look at a couple of examples now about sometimes some tricky situations and how you might handle them as an ally. So let's look at this one. Your colleague Ashley tells you she got engaged over the weekend. You ask, oh, congratulations, who's the lucky guy? She replies, actually, her name is Rachel. So how can you respond? I want to first encourage us to not ignore it, but also not to make it a big deal. Acknowledge your mistake with a quick sorry and move on with the conversation. So for example, you might say, oh, sorry, congratulations to you and Rachel. What was the proposal like? So again, not ignoring the mistake, but also not dwelling. Let's look at another one. So Sally, a woman on your team, arrives at a formal corporate function wearing a pantsuit. The other women on the team are wearing gowns. One of the customer points to Sally and asks, is that gentleman on your team? So how do you proceed? So when someone is misgendered, what I encourage you to do is to say their name, correct the pronoun, and introduce the person by giving some details about the person that is not related to their attire or gender. Share some of their accomplishments, interests, education, background, just like you would do when introducing a gender-conforming person. So in this example, you might say, oh, that's Sally. Yes, she's on our team. She joined our team last year. She handles all of our customer accounts. She was an engineering grad. Let me introduce you to. So as we're finishing up, I want to really, again, encourage us to speak out against bias. Right? And so best practices involve us using facts. Right? So explaining why a word or phrase is considered a slur or not appropriate. So you could say things like using that's gay to mean something is bad or stupid is hurtful. Gay doesn't mean stupid. Make it also about you. So you could say things like, I consider myself to be an ally, and what you said isn't okay with me because I don't like to hear that about a group of people being stereotyped and disrespected like that. Also, make your comments relatable. So you could say, how would you feel if someone told that joke about you or one of your members of your family? So I'm going to stop right there and open it up to questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marjorie. I did have one question. So people are often shy or uncomfortable about approaching or asking the question initially. Is that appropriate to do, to ask someone their sexual orientation?
It's not appropriate to ask someone their sexual orientation. That's a really great point to say. Think about what you would like to be asked about yourself, that things are private. It is appropriate to ask for people's pronouns, and I would encourage you to do that by introducing yourself and sharing your own pronouns. If people choose to share their sexual orientation, that's wonderful, but in no way is it acceptable or expected that people would share that with you without prompting. You can think of it as, are you close enough friends? Do you have a kind of relationship where you would share personal details about your life? Great question.
Yeah, and if a person does share their sexual orientation, without being asked, is it appropriate or to continue, to ask questions about it?
So I think it depends on what's shared. I would think of it as how you would talk to any friend. You wouldn't ask your friend about private parts of their lives. And so it's okay to reference asking who they're dating, things that they've already shared, but I wouldn't ask personal questions that go further than what people have already shared.
Okay. Thanks, Marjorie. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if there are none, did you want to have any last comments, Marjorie?
No, I shared my email address at the end. People are welcome to reach out to me if they do have other questions going forward. Okay,
and so also we can have a copy of your presentation if anyone wanted it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so please, if anyone wants it, they can email us at humanrights@southbendin.gov, or you can call the commission and we can certainly get it to you. The phone number is 574-235-9355. And I just wanted to add, as it relates to the EEOC, they have long interpreted sex discrimination to include gender identity and gender orientation. And just this past June, the Supreme Court indicated that federal law protects the LGBTQ community. So they just reaffirmed what the EEOC was already doing. So if that is it, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and thank Marjorie again for her presentation. It was very informative and insightful. Thank you so much. And that concludes our webinar for today. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Marjorie.
Thank you.
So Marjorie, will you?